Mark's grandfather had been urging him to stay the night, reminding him that the hills surrounding the village could be dangerous after dark. Though Mark laughed it off, joking about the mythical Drekavac coming to get him, his grandfather remained silent, staring flatly. They had spent the day together cutting and preparing firewood for the winter at his grandfather's remote house in the southern hills of Serbia, and as evening fell, the work took longer than expected. By the time they were done, the sun had already begun to set behind the tired hills, casting long shadows over the land. Mark insisted he would catch the bus home, but with each passing minute, the idea of walking down the winding roads alone at night seemed less appealing. His grandfather mentioned how there were now streetlights along the roads, making it safer, but Mark still cracked jokes about the threats that lurked in the dark. Yet, there was something in his grandfather's serious expression that made him pause. His grandfather, who had lived alone since the death of the grandmother, likely didn't just want him to stay for company, but perhaps to share something more profound. Eventually, Mark agreed to stay over for the night, with the condition that his grandfather would tell him a story. His grandfather's smile was faint, almost reluctant, but he agreed, telling Mark to let his father know. The grandfather went inside to fetch something and came back with a dusty old bottle. He poured the brandy for both of them, and they crossed themselves in the traditional Orthodox Christian way, a custom that had been passed down in their family for generations. Mark asked about the old, dusty bottle, intrigued by its presence. His grandfather's face grew serious as he explained that the bottle was part of the story he was about to tell. The story, he said, was the reason he never ventured into the hills at night anymore, and the reason he didn't want Mark to either. He asked what Mark knew about the region's history, specifically about the hills and mountains. Mark admitted he didn't know much beyond the village, so the grandfather began to explain. Under Ottoman rule, the area had seen many skirmishes, and there had been no time for proper burials during the wars. Bodies of soldiers from both sides had been left to rot in the woods, and it was believed that the restless spirits of those men still haunted the hills. Despite Mark's skepticism, the grandfather's words made an impact. He had read about these wars in history books, but hearing it from his grandfather, it felt different, more real, somehow. The grandfather's voice grew deeper as he continued. When he was a young man, he had been walking back from the town, a long distance away, after selling some tobacco. Nightfall had caught him, and the darkness of the woods made it difficult to see. However, he was lucky enough to have patches of moonlight to guide him. Then, out of nowhere, he began hearing music that seemed to be coming from a wedding celebration. The grandfather's eyes grew distant as he recalled the strange event. He remembered walking into a field, where he saw what appeared to be 20 or 30 people, gathered in celebration, though only their silhouettes were visible. Mark, trying to make sense of the oddity of it all, asked how such a gathering could happen in the middle of the night in those remote hills. The grandfather explained that despite the bizarre nature of it, it felt real to him in the moment. One of the men had approached him, offering him a drink and telling him they were celebrating. Hesitant at first, the grandfather had accepted, reasoning that he could use a drink before his long walk home. The atmosphere had seemed odd, but it felt right at the time, and so he took the drink from the stranger. As the grandfather spoke, the smile left his face entirely. The room grew heavy with the weight of his words. He explained that just before he drank, he had crossed himself, a gesture that was more than just a custom. It was a protection, a way of calling upon divine intervention to ward off evil. He had done so instinctively, and as soon as he crossed himself, everything changed. The music stopped, the people vanished, and the most terrifying part was that he wasn't even in the field anymore. He had found himself standing on the edge of a bridge, as if he was about to jump into the river below. The grandfather believed that the devil or some restless spirit had lured him to that spot, tempting him to take his own life. But the crossing, he believed, had been a divine intervention. That was the moment he realized he would never again walk these hills after dark. The grandfather's expression grew even more grave as he continued. He asked Mark if he knew how he could be certain it wasn't a dream. Mark, confused, shook his head. The grandfather lifted the dusty bottle, showing Mark that it was the very same one he had been offered all those years ago. Even after everything else had disappeared, that bottle had remained in his hand, a reminder of the terrifying experience he had survived. Mark stared at the bottle, still skeptical but now deeply unsettled. His grandfather had lived a long, difficult life, and though the stories had always seemed exaggerated, this one, with the old bottle in his hand, felt different. The grandfather's tale hung in the air, a warning not to ignore the darkness of the hills and the forces that might linger there, unseen and waiting. A professional photographer was hired to finally capture a perfect picture of the kids. These children seemed to follow their own version of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, only one ever managed to smile at a time. Tired of swapping heads in Photoshop for Christmas cards, it seemed time to call in an expert. The photo shoot went well. The family enjoyed a pleasant outdoor session at the edge of the woods. The son and daughter hugged, smiled, and posed as instructed. Everything appeared perfect. That feeling lasted until the photos arrived. Looking through the digital album, something odd caught the eye, a hand, where there shouldn't have been one. The family gathered around the computer. The father, Frank, inspected the image. It seemed like the usual, Isabella's hand here, Jack's there. But something didn't add up. Jack's hand appeared in a different position, hanging at his side, despite what was shown in the image. He had refused to put his arm around his sister during the session, everyone recalled. Yet in the photograph, Isabella's hand rested on her shoulder, and beneath it, another hand appeared, even though Jack's hand was clearly visible elsewhere. The family puzzled over the strange sight, suspecting perhaps an editing mistake. It looked as if the photographer had attempted to position Jack's hand around Isabella but forgot to erase the original. The mother wished the photographer had mentioned this oddity beforehand. The edit looked unsettling. More unnerving, the hand didn't seem to belong to either child. It was too large, too adult-like. Where, she wondered, had the photographer sourced such a strange image? Flipping further through the album, she stopped at a photo where Jack, for once, had wrapped his arms around Isabella. Both kids looked at the camera, a seemingly perfect shot, except for one detail. An extra hand rested atop Jack's, with just 2 fingers overlapping his own. She might have missed it if not for the earlier photo. Frank was called over again and joked that perhaps the photographer had used AI to edit the pictures, suggesting that modern tools could make such changes, sometimes even when not requested. This led to growing concern. The idea of the children's images being uploaded into an AI system felt like a violation of privacy. The worry grew into anger, and the mother called the photographer, Janice, demanding answers. Janice sounded distraught and insisted she had not used any AI tools, promising to prove it. Within the hour, Janice arrived, bringing her camera and original files. She displayed the untouched photos and their metadata on her computer and camera screen. The extra hands were there, present in the originals. There was no evidence of manipulation. Despite lingering doubts, Janice's sincerity seemed genuine. After Janice left, confusion deepened. The extra hands remained an unsolved mystery. The photos were examined again and again, but there was no explanation. It had to be AI, the mother thought, yet nothing supported that idea. That night, after putting the children to bed, the parents tried to relax in front of the TV. The unease lingered, the images replaying in her mind. Later, she went upstairs to check on the kids and froze in the doorway. Isabella was sprawled across her bed, one hand dangling toward the floor. From beneath the bed, another hand seemed to be reaching up, holding hers. In a panic, she switched on the light, but nothing remained. Frank rushed in and searched the room, laughing at the fright, but found nothing, not under the bed, not in the closet, not in Jack's room. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw hands belonging to emaciated bodies hidden under beds, to criminals breaking in, to nothing at all, crawling spider-like across the floor. She finally drifted off. At 3 a.m., she awoke suddenly. Still groggy, she realized Frank was holding her hand, something he never did in his sleep. Turning to face him, she noticed the hand grasping hers wasn't attached to Frank at all. Panic surged, and as she screamed, the hand seemed to vanish into the shadowy folds of the covers. A frantic search followed. The entire house was checked. Nothing out of place, yet her own hand throbbed with pain. 5 angry red scratches stood out on her palm, bleeding. Overwhelmed, she broke down, unable to bear it any longer. Her hand tingled, numb and strange. While waiting for the police, she scrolled through security camera footage. Every entrance and exit had been secure, no one appeared on the cameras. But a detail in the footage from the previous day drew her attention. As the family returned home from the park, a hand could be seen on her shoulder, yet Frank was not standing close enough to touch her. No logical explanation surfaced. Only the haunting presence of extra hands remained. I wasn't a typical child. Despite the thousands of questions I had growing up, I was too obedient to ask them. While other kids went through their why phases, I, though naturally curious, was content to accept, because I said so. I didn't question the rules and followed them blindly. I couldn't open the window because they said so, and so I didn't. But the questions I didn't ask created a conflict with the theories and stories I built in my mind. When my younger brother, Luis, entered his why phase, I found myself needing to answer questions I couldn't fully understand myself. I came up with the most plausible explanations. It was to keep mosquitoes out, to prevent burglars from breaking in, or to keep some madman from staring at us through binoculars. But Luis wasn't like me. Our parents weren't as strict with him, and he didn't accept vague explanations. He wanted to learn for himself. I remember one evening, as our father sat down to dinner, Luis asked him why we couldn't open the window. What if the house caught fire and we needed to escape? Our father sighed deeply and calmly insisted that it was forbidden, that the house wouldn't catch fire, and that there was nothing to worry about. Luis kept pushing, but our father, without a second thought, ordered him to finish his soup and go to bed. Luis's questions continued to nag at me, deepening the ones I had never dared to ask. After all, if Luis got a sharp word for his curiosity, I was the one who would be punished more severely, perhaps with a slap, or worse. One day, when I was 14, I went to a friend's house for a sleepover. Luis, still 10, stayed home. When I returned the next morning, I immediately noticed something was off. Luis was acting distant and strange. He didn't initiate any conversation and only gave 1 or 2 word responses to my questions. He spent a long time lying on the laundry room floor, staring blankly at nothing. After persistent prodding, he finally admitted he was tired but refused to go back to our shared bedroom alone. That night, despite my reassurances, our mother forced him to sleep in the room. I promised him I'd be there beside him, trying to comfort him. That was when he finally spoke. He leaned in close, whispering that he had opened the window the day before. Curiosity overpowered my fear and obedience. I leaned closer to him, eager to uncover what had happened, though my excitement barely hid itself. He took his time before responding. He told me nothing had really happened, but that it felt like something did. His heart had raced, and he'd gotten so cold he thought he was going to die. But then he spoke of something else, something I wasn't ready for. He said he felt as though something had entered the room, something unseen but present. He described whispers that would come when they were almost asleep, whispers he couldn't quite understand but that he could hear right in his ear. I tried to dismiss his words as nightmares fueled by guilt, but he wasn't convinced. He laid down with his eyes wide open, unable to sleep. I soon tried to sleep too, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard the whispers, indistinct, muffled, but undeniably there. I turned, expecting to find Luis standing beside my bed, but he was across the room, lying down, motionless. I told myself it was just my own fear reacting to Luis's anxiety, but the whispers persisted, gnawing at my nerves. Later, I woke in the middle of the night, gasping for air, my lungs feeling as though they were suffocating. The whispers grew clearer, incomprehensible yet terrifying. The hairs on my body stood on end. A sick thought filled my mind: what if Luis was right? What if something had come through the window, just as he had said? What if that's what our parents were so desperately trying to keep out? From that moment on, our childhood took on an increasingly strange and eerie quality. We began hearing strange sounds in the house when no one else was around. We'd catch glimpses of silhouettes moving in the corner of our eyes, and sometimes we'd feel inexplicably cold even in the middle of summer. There were times we heard scratching noises or the sound of footsteps when no one was there. But we always dismissed it, attributing it to our anxious imaginations. We never told our parents about the window. Doing so would only get us in trouble. I kept reassuring Luis that nothing was hurting us, that we should just ignore it and move on. But even our parents noticed how we looked more and more fearful, how stressed we had become. Yet, their response was always more annoyance than concern. When we were too scared to sleep in that room, we'd lie on the living room floor. I'd make sure to get up early so our parents wouldn't question why we weren't in bed. Whenever we could, we'd stay with our grandparents, escaping the oppressive atmosphere at home. Their house had fewer rules, and we could finally act like kids without getting into trouble. When Luis turned 13 and I was 17, he went to his first sleepover alone, and I found myself alone in that room for the first time. I thought I was old enough to not give in to fear. To prove it to myself, I did something completely foolish. I decided to watch a horror movie alone in that very room. At first, it worked. I convinced myself the anxiety was just from the movie. I told myself that the room was just a room, that there were no hauntings or anything supernatural. It was oddly freeing to let go of the fear for a while. But then, the window slammed open by itself, even though the lock was still in place. The noise was so loud it made me recoil, instinctively covering my head. Once I realized what had happened, I rushed to the window to close it. My mom came into the room, asking what I was doing, but I quickly lied, saying I had dropped my physics book. She bought the excuse, and I was left alone with my fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours pacing, my mind racing with fear and anger. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that I finally laid down, still unable to calm my nerves. As my eyes closed, the whispering returned, clearer this time: "Her fault, trapped here, let me out, kill her." The words made my stomach churn, and I couldn't stop myself from getting up again, shivering and sweating. I paced again, convinced I was losing my mind. When morning came, I forced myself to act normal, though inside, I was anything but. I didn't tell anyone what I had heard, not even Luis. The fear and anxiety never left us until we moved away. There are still questions I haven't dared to ask, things I've left unsaid. And Luis? He doesn't ask questions anymore either. In fact, we never talk about it. But sometimes, I feel like I'm going to lose my mind if I don't find out what was in that room, what came through that window, and, most importantly, why it was there in the first place.